The great hall smelled of roasting pumpkin and warm candle wax, and Harry had been ignoring his plate for the better part of 10 minutes. It was not that the food was bad. The food at Hogwarts was never bad, which was one of the more astonishing things about being here. The chicken was perfect. The treacle tart sat at the far end of the table like a small gold promise. But Harry kept glancing down the length of the Gryffindor table, counting heads without quite knowing why. Ron had no such trouble. He was working through a mountain of mashed potato with the focus of someone who had spent the afternoon losing a chess to himself and was recouping on different terms. "You're not eating," Ron observed, not looking up. "The treacle tart's good." Harry didn't answer. He was thinking about the corridor outside the Charms classroom. He was thinking about Hermione Granger's face and the specific way her shoulders had gone up around her ears when she overheard Ron's remark on the way to lunch. He hadn't said anything then. None of them had, and then the afternoon had happened, and now it was the Halloween feast, and Hermione Granger was not at the table. He counted again. She definitely was not at the table. He was about to say something to Ron when the doors of the great hall flew open. Professor Quirrell came sprinting in, his turban slightly askew, his robes disordered, his face the color of old chalk. He reached the center of the room, looked around at them all with eyes that weren't quite focusing, and then announced, in a voice that cracked through the feast like a dropped glass, that there was a troll in the dungeon. Then he fainted. The great hall went very loud, very fast. Dumbledore's voice rose above it all, calm and carrying, and then the prefects were moving, and Harry was on his feet, with 600 other students being pressed forward in a warm human current toward the dormitory corridor. He stopped moving. Ron. He grabbed Ron's arm. "Hermione doesn't know. She's been in the bathroom since this morning. She wasn't at the feast. She doesn't know about the troll." Ron's expression went through several things in quick succession and arrived at something that looked like reluctant acceptance of an obviously terrible plan. "All right," he said. "Come on, then." It earned them elbows, a sharp look from a prefect who didn't quite manage to catch them, and the novel sensation of being the only people in a castle full of people moving in the wrong direction. Their footsteps echoed off stone. The candles along the walls threw long shadows that shifted as they ran. They heard it before they saw it. Not loud, precisely, but massive. A sound felt through the soles of their shoes before the ears caught up. A smell followed, something ancient and rotten, like bins in summer. And then there it was at the far end of the corridor. 12 feet of grey-green muscle and thick bone, a wooden club dragging behind it on the flagstones, moving with the rolling gait of something that had never in its life needed to be afraid of anything. It turned its enormous head, looked at nothing in particular, and went through a door. "That's the girls' bathroom," Ron said. His voice came out very small. They ran. Harry got his hand on the iron key already in the bathroom door lock and turned it, without thinking, with the animal urgency of someone who had heard something large and terrible go through a door and locked it from the outside. Then Hermione screamed. Harry and Ron looked at each other. Harry unlocked the door, and they went in. The bathroom was not a small room, but the troll made it small. Hermione was pressed against the far wall between two sinks, her bushy hair wild around her face, her brown eyes fixed on something that had not noticed yet, that 2 more people had entered the room. The troll's club was raised. Harry had perhaps 2 seconds. He had no plan. He did what his body decided in the absence of one. He ran forward, jumped, and grabbed the troll around the neck from behind. He immediately regretted this. The troll lurched sideways, made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a roar, and began to swing its enormous head. Harry clung on. His wand, he'd had it out when he jumped, which had seemed like a good idea at the time, went up one of the troll's nostrils. The troll screamed. Harry held on. He was terrified in a way that had gone past thought and into something purely physical. A welling pressure behind his ribs and in his hands and his throat, the kind he half recognized from the school roof in primary, from the time his hair had grown back overnight, to from all those moments when his body had done something extraordinary before he'd had any say in the matter. It was larger this time. It was building, and it had nowhere to go, and the troll was still thrashing, and Hermione was scrambling toward the door. Her hand went out to brace herself against the wall. She found not the wall, but Harry's arm. The moment her fingers closed around his wrist, the magic went through. He felt it leave him like a cord pulled taut and released, a pulse, a shudder, something gold-white and soundless, and over in an instant. Hermione made a small, sharp sound that was not quite a gasp. She went very still, pressed there against the wall with her hand around his wrist, and her eyes went to his, even though he was still dangling off a troll. Her grip didn't loosen. Neither of them had time to speak about it. "Wingardium Leviosa," Ron's voice cracked slightly on the second syllable, which was exactly where the emphasis was meant to fall. The troll's club rose smoothly from its hand, hung in the air for one extraordinary and improbable moment, and then Ron brought it down on the troll's head with great authority. The troll sat down. Then, slowly, it fell over. Harry landed badly, and spent a moment on one knee on the bathroom tiles, breathing. The troll was unconscious. The club was on the floor. 3 first-years were alive, which felt like the central fact. Hermione was staring at her own hand. The door opened. Professor McGonagall came in first, with Professor Snape behind her and Professor Quirrell behind him. McGonagall looked at the unconscious troll and then at the 3 of them, and she went a particular shade of white that Harry had already learned meant the specific version of her fury that came with complete, total words. "What on earth were you thinking? You could have been killed." Hermione stepped forward. Harry watched her do it, watched the decision form behind her eyes and get made in approximately half a second. "Please, Professor," she said, and her voice came out steadier than he would have managed in her position. Steadier probably than she'd expected. "It's my fault. I went looking for it. I thought I could handle a mountain troll on my own. I've read about them. The silence that followed had weight." McGonagall took 5 points from Gryffindor for recklessness. She gave 5 each to Harry and Ron for her exact phrasing, sheer nerve, which she was careful to distinguish from intelligence. Then she sent them out into the corridor, and by some unspoken agreement, all 3 of them walked back toward Gryffindor Tower together, and nobody said anything about what had happened in the bathroom, except the troll part, because the troll part was the only part any of them had words for yet. In the common room, the relief metabolized quickly into something giddy and slightly hysterical, the way it does after near disaster. Ron was retelling the troll's expression when the club hit it, and Harry was laughing, and the fire was warm, and the portrait hole was shut. It should have been simply good. Harry kept glancing at the staircase through which Hermione had disappeared 5 minutes ago, with a quiet goodnight and a careful, measured walk. When he stopped, looking at the stairs, he noticed it properly for the first time, a thread somewhere behind his sternum. That was the only word that fit, which seemed inadequate, but was the most accurate one available. It led in the direction she had gone, not painful, not frightening, not exactly, just present, in the way that a healed wound is present, an awareness where there had been nothing before. He sat by the fire until the laughter wound down and the common room emptied, and then he went up to bed with the thread still there, pointing steadily through 2 floors of stone toward a girl with bushy brown hair who had lied for them without being asked, and whom he had known until approximately this evening, mainly as the person who raised her hand more than anyone else in every class. He lay in the dark and thought, something is different. He didn't yet know what, but the thread pointed faithfully through the wall. Harry woke before the others. He lay on his back in the grey pre-dawn of the dormitory, listening to Seamus breathe and Dean shift in his sleep, and he was aware, immediately, before he'd quite decided to be awake, that the thread was still there. He'd half hoped, going to bed the previous night, that he would wake to find it gone. A strange sensation explained by adrenaline and trolls, and a very unusual Halloween. But it was not gone. It was oriented, pointing with the quiet confidence of a compass needle, somewhere through the upper stone of the tower toward the left and up, which was the direction of the girls' dormitory. He was 11 years old. He had no framework for this. He lay still for another minute, turning the awareness over in his mind the way you might test a loose tooth with your tongue. It wasn't a feeling exactly, not like hunger or cold, more like knowing which foot he'd been sleeping on, except the foot was on a different floor, a location, a presence. He rotated his attention toward it, and the thread held steady. Hermione Granger was somewhere above and to the left, through approximately 2 floors of stone. He got dressed quietly, slipped out of the dormitory and went downstairs to sit by the fire, which had burned down to orange embers in the night. The common room was cold and entirely empty. He sat in the armchair nearest the hearth and watched the embers and tried to think about what had happened in a way that produced useful information, and found that it did not. Hermione had been awake for 40 minutes before Harry came downstairs. She had woken at 5:20 with the certainty, absolute and geographically precise, that Harry Potter was in a dormitory 1 floor below hers. She had lain with her eyes open, testing it, turning her head as though that would change the answer. She pictured the castle's layout, which she had memorized from a diagram in her 2nd week of term, and placed him in it. Down 1 floor the boys' tower, the directional sense did not waver. She was frightened. She got up before the other girls stirred, and went through her supplementary reading with a candle. Not the set texts, she'd already read those, but the additional books she'd brought from home. She checked the indexes, read the relevant passages, applied the methodical approach that had always worked before. It did not work this time. The closest she found was a reference to empathic resonance in bonded magical creatures, clearly inapplicable, and a footnote about sympathetic charm linkages, which required deliberate casting. She ruled both out and made a list of ruled-out explanations, because knowing what something wasn't was at least a kind of progress. Then she closed her books and went down to breakfast. Harry was already in the great hall. He was at the Gryffindor table with Ron beside him, and she could feel, as she crossed the hall toward them, that he registered her approach before he should have been able to hear her footsteps in the noise of hundreds of students eating breakfast. She saw his head come up a fraction of a second early. She sat down across from him. Ron reached for the toast. "I can feel which direction you are," Harry said, keeping his voice low under the noise of the hall. He had the expression of someone delivering information they would rather not have, even when I can't see you. It's like knowing a direction, like a compass. Hermione's throat was very tight. "I've known exactly where you are since I woke up," she said. "You were in that armchair by the fire." Harry stared at her. "I moved. I know you moved to the table." She paused. I followed it, a beat of silence between them. "Neither of you are eating," Ron said. He'd been absorbed in his own breakfast, and he'd caught only the tail of their exchange, enough to notice the silence, not enough to have followed the content. Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Hermione. They came to the same conclusion at the same moment, without speaking. "Not yet, not hungry," Harry said. "I had something earlier," Hermione said, which was not quite true, and she reached for the pumpkin juice to give her hands something to do. After breakfast, they found an empty corridor on the second floor, a narrow passage between the Transfiguration wing and the main staircase, reliably unpopulated on a Saturday morning. Hermione walked away from Harry and counted her steps. 30. She stopped. Then she thought deliberately and without flinching about Parvati's face yesterday in Charms, the specific look that blended pity with amusement. The one Hermione had learned in 6 weeks of this school meant that someone was simultaneously aware of how clever she was and how few friends she had. She felt the full weight of it and did not push it away. Across 30 feet of corridor, Harry went very still. "You felt sad," he said after a moment. He looked startled and then uncomfortable, and then carefully neutral. It came through, not like words, more like a weather change. He paused, like something cold moved through a room. Hermione walked back toward him. She was practicing being steady, and she thought she was managing it. "Could you describe what kind of sad?" she asked. He thought about it seriously. He was better at thinking seriously than she had expected him to be. "Like being on the outside of a window," he said. "Looking at something you're not part of." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something moved between them that was not through the bond, just the ordinary human recognition of two people who have, between them, a great deal of experience with windows. "This is not a documented phenomenon," Hermione said. "I've checked. I went through everything I have access to, and the directional sense and the emotional transmission together don't match anything with a name. This is accidental magic of a kind that has apparently not been studied, or not been studied in anything available to first years." She paused. "We need to tell someone with more knowledge than us. An adult." Harry was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to." "Neither do I," she said it plainly, because it was the truth, and she found that stating the truth plainly was usually more efficient than managing around it. "But the longer we wait, the more likely it is that someone notices the thing we haven't explained." He didn't argue, which told her he'd already reached the same conclusion and was merely resisting it. They agreed, with the reluctance of people committing to a sensible decision they disliked, to say nothing today, to keep it between themselves for now, and to find the headmaster tomorrow. They were almost back to the main staircase when Ron appeared at the top of it. "There you are," he said, with a cheerful accusation of someone who hadn't been worried, but is making a minor point of the fact that he'd noticed an absence. He looked between them and something moved across his face that Hermione filed carefully. Not suspicion, not jealousy. It was too early for jealousy, she thought, though she also thought it was something adjacent to the seed of it. A noticing. A quiet registration of something not quite explained. "What were you doing down there?" Ron asked, talking, Harry said. Ron accepted this and fell into step beside Harry as they went up the stairs, and he started telling them about Neville and a floating charm that had misfired at breakfast and produced a small crater in the porridge. And Harry laughed, and Ron laughed, and they went up together. But Hermione, half a step behind, had seen that brief flicker in Ron's face, and she thought, this will need to be managed carefully. She filed it under things to watch, and kept walking. At the top of the stairs they went in separate directions. Ron and Harry toward the common room, Hermione toward the library. As the distance between them grew, she felt it, a faint, elastic resistance, like something gently stretched rather than pulled. Not painful, not dramatic. Barely worth noting if you were the sort of person who didn't make a practice of noting things. She walked toward the library and noted it. Harry, going the other way, was heading back to the dormitory to retrieve his potions textbook, and the thread went with him and did not break, and he walked up the stairs thinking, nothing about this is going to be simple. He'd thought that last night, watching the fire. Door. He was more certain of it now, with the morning having produced directional knowledge of another person's location and a flash of her sadness through the wall of 30 feet of castle corridor. He got the textbook. He went back downstairs. The thread hummed steadily toward wherever Hermione was in the library, too far to feel the texture of her thoughts, just the direction, just the fact of her. He thought at least she is the kind of person who makes lists. The Ministry Owl arrived at Hogwarts on the morning of the 2nd of November, which was a Sunday, which was the kind of timing that suggested the improper use of magic office did not believe in days off. It was a formal bird, grey-feathered, stiff-postured, carrying a letter sealed with purple wax and addressed to the headmaster in the precise, bureaucratic hand of someone who had written thousands of such letters and considered flourishes a waste of ministry ink. It went directly to Dumbledore's owl post, which meant it did not pass through the owlry or appear at the breakfast table with the other post, and so Harry and Hermione spent Sunday morning unaware that anything official had begun to move in their direction. Dumbledore read the letter in his office. He read it once, put it down, and looked at it for a long moment, with the expression of a man considering several futures at once. The letter was not precisely a surprise. The Trace's detection of a wandless magical event of considerable power on the night of Halloween in the vicinity of a registered underage wizard. This was exactly what the improper use of magic office was designed to notice. What it had noticed and what it had written in its careful bureaucratic sentences was only the first movement of something much larger. He folded the letter. He picked up a quill. He wrote 2 short notes, sealed them, and sent them to Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, requesting their presence in his office after supper. Then he went to his afternoon appointments, because the castle did not stop requiring a headmaster on account of ministry letters. Harry received his note in the common room at 4:30, while attempting to make progress on a transfiguration essay and not making much. He read it twice. His first thought was, I am in trouble. His second thought was, I haven't done anything wrong. His third, arriving harder, except that something happened in a bathroom 2 nights ago that I can't explain, and now someone official knows about it. He found Hermione at the library table where she'd been for most of the day, with a note of her own already in her hand. She looked at him. He looked at her. The bond delivered a quiet pulse of her anxiety through the thread, distinct from his own, and he thought, good, she's worried too. He wasn't sure whether that was reassuring. They went up to Dumbledore's office after supper. The stone gargoyle leapt aside when Dumbledore's password, which they'd been given in the note, was spoken, and the moving staircase carried them up in a slow spiral to the door. Harry had never been in the headmaster's office before. It was circular, which he hadn't expected, and large enough that it didn't feel crowded despite everything in it. Silver instruments on spindly tables, turning and emitting small puffs of smoke with the self-importance of things that consider themselves busy. The portraits of former headmasters along the walls. Several of them watching the newcomers with the candid interest of people who have been on walls for decades and welcome the variety. And a perch near the window where a large flame-colored bird sat sleeping with its head tucked under one wing. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked exactly as he did in the great hall, very tall, very thin, with silver hair and beard that reached past his waist, the half-moon spectacles sitting low on the crooked bridge of his nose, except that here, in his own room, there was the particular quality of someone at ease in themselves that Harry had not quite registered in the larger spaces of the school. "Sit down," Dumbledore said, and gestured to the chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the short notice." They sat. The chairs were not uncomfortable, which Harry had not expected either. "I'm going to ask you something," Dumbledore said, settling back in his own chair and folding his hands. "And I want you to tell me what actually happened on Halloween night. Not what you told Professor McGonagall, though I understand why you told her what you did, and I don't intend to revisit that. What actually happened after the troll was dealt with." There was a silence. Hermione glanced at Harry, and Harry, after a half-second, gave a small nod. She spoke first. She always found the words faster than he did, and she organized them better, which he'd already come to understand as simply being one of the facts of who she was. She described the moment in the bathroom, the troll falling, the discharge of energy she'd felt when her hand closed around Harry's wrist, the gold-white pulse between them that neither had asked for and neither had understood. She described the directional awareness that had been present since she woke the following morning, and the emotional echo she had felt during the corridor test, and the faint elastic resistance at distance. She was precise, and she was thorough, and when she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Dumbledore and waited. Harry said, "And I can tell. When she feels something sharp, like sadness or fear, it comes through, like weather." Dumbledore had not interrupted them once. He was quiet for a moment after Harry finished. He took off his spectacles, cleaned them with the corner of his robe and put them back on. This appeared to be his version of thinking. "What you are describing," he said at last, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word as he would choose a tool, "is consistent with a class of magical event that is documented, though it is extremely rare. A magical bond, involuntary, accidental, formed through a wandless discharge of accidental magic, at the moment of physical contact, under conditions of acute fear." Hermione's head came up at the word documented. "The trace," Dumbledore continued, "detected the event. I have received a letter from the Ministry's improper use of magic office this morning. They have noted a wandless magical event of unusual power at Hogwarts. On the night of October the 31st, he paused. Accidental magic produced under a life-threatening situation is protected under Clause 7 of the Decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery. The formation of the bond was therefore not illegal. However, the Ministry, when it investigates a verified magical event between two witches or wizards, applies a specific legal framework, the same framework that governs binding magical contracts." "That's ridiculous," Harry said. "I didn't agree to anything." "No," Dumbledore said. He said it without any particular inflection, neither agreeing that it was ridiculous, nor suggesting it wasn't. "You didn't. That, I'm afraid, is rather the point of the Ministry's concern." Hermione's voice was steady. "Binding magical contracts don't require agreement, do they? They require formation. It came out as a statement rather than a question." "That is the Ministry's position," Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry sat with that. He thought about being told things, about having no say. A memory arrived that he hadn't invited, a small dark space, a locked door, and he pushed it away and looked at his hands, which were on his knees, and said nothing. "Has a formal ruling been made?" Hermione asked. Not yet. They have flagged the event and opened an inquiry. I will respond to the Ministry's letter this evening and request time for a thorough investigation before any classification is determined. I cannot guarantee the outcome of that request. He looked at her carefully. I want to be honest with you both. I can advocate for you. I cannot make the Ministry ignore its own law. What do we do in the meantime? Harry asked. Precisely what you have been doing, Dumbledore said. Continue with your studies, tell no one. And there was something in his tone that was not quite weight, but was adjacent to it. Come and see me if anything about the bond changes. He walked them to the door. They went quietly down the moving staircase, and Dumbledore watched the door close, and stood for a moment with the stillness of a man allowing himself, in private, to be less than certain. He went back to his desk and looked at the Ministry's letter. There was something in what they had described, the quality of the magic, the specific texture of what Harry had produced in that bathroom, that he recognized distantly from a knowledge accumulated over many decades. The oldest magic did not always announce itself through incantations. Sometimes it chose its own form, shaped by terror and contact, and the body's instinct to protect. He had seen something like it once before in what Lily Potter had made when she died, something with a particular intention, even an accidental one. He did not have enough yet to be certain. He folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He would write to the Ministry in the morning, and he would watch as he always watched, and wait. The flame-colored bird on the perch shifted in its sleep, and the instruments turned quietly in the dark. The Ministry representative arrived on the 7th of November, a Thursday, which was the kind of day that felt ordinary until it stopped being one. He was a small, precise man from the improper use of magic office, carrying a leather case and wearing robes the color of plums. He had the air of someone who had performed this particular function many times and found it neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply procedural. Dumbledore met him at the entrance with the particular courtesy that managed, without any specific rudeness, to convey that this was Dumbledore's school, and the visitor was here on sufferance rather than by right. Harry and Hermione were summoned from their afternoon classes. Harry sat through the last 20 minutes of History of Magic, knowing that a Ministry official was somewhere in the castle waiting for him, which made it even harder than usual to attend to the Goblin rebellions. Hermione was already waiting outside the headmaster's office when Harry arrived, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, and her expression arranged into the version of calm she assembled when she was not, in fact, calm. He was learning to read the difference. They were shown in. The Ministry man opened his case, produced a document of several pages bound with purple ribbon, and read it aloud with the precise diction of someone who has rehearsed this and finds the ritual comforting. The bond formed on the 31st of October 1991 between Harry James Potter, age 11, and Hermione Jean Granger, age 12, was classified as an involuntary accidental magical bond formed under Clause 7 protected circumstances. Under the relevant statute of wizarding contract law, any magical bond formed between two witches or wizards carried the same legal standing as a binding magical contract. Binding magical contracts were held inviolate by the Ministry of Magic. The bond could not be dissolved by ministry action. He turned the page and kept reading. Harry stopped hearing individual words at a certain point. The sounds continued. Formal phrasing, legal citations, the Ministry's considered assessment. But they had assembled themselves into a single fact. This happened to you, and there is nothing you can do about it. Hermione was listening carefully. He could feel it through the bond, a focused, intent sharpness, the quality of her attention when she was taking in information she hadn't yet been given a page to write on. The official put the first document down and produced a second from his case. The practical implications. The bond did not alter the legal status of either party. School, enrollment, guardian arrangements, and family relationships remained unchanged. What it did mean, the ministry formally recorded the bond's existence. Any attempt to sever it through dark or experimental countermagic was illegal. And the bond itself carried certain natural properties. The official's voice became carefully neutral here, like a man reading a clause he personally found inconvenient. The emotional and directional link between the bonded parties would intensify if they were kept forcibly separated for extended periods. This was a property inherent to bonds of this type, not a ministry-imposed measure. "I see," Hermione said. Harry said nothing. He was looking at the document. He was 11 years old, and he had been told that something had happened to him without his consent, and the people whose job it was to make rules had decided the rule was that he would simply have to live with it. An unwanted memory arrived. A small dark space, a lock turning from the outside. The specific understanding of a child who has learned that you do not get to object to things being decided about you. He looked at the ruling and felt the particular quietness that was not the absence of anger, but the place anger went when it had nowhere to go. He did not say any of that. He sat still. Hermione beside him asked 2 questions. First, was there an appeal process available? Yes. Appeals regarding magical contract rulings could be submitted to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A hearing would be arranged. Second, was there any documented case in ministry records where a bond of this type had been successfully dissolved through legal means? The official paused. He said, "No, there was no documented precedent." She took her notebook from her bag. She had apparently brought it and wrote down both answers in her small, precise handwriting. She underlined the word appeal. She put a question mark beside the word precedent, and then, after a moment, a second question mark. Harry had learned, in approximately the past week, that 2 question marks meant she had already started thinking about what the answer might be, and intended to find out whether she was right. He suspected that question mark represented a considerable amount of future library time, and that she was going to enjoy it rather more than the situation warranted. When the ministry man had gone, case collected, farewell accepted, Dumbledore came back to his desk and sat down. "I want to be clear with you," he said. "Before this ruling was issued, I wrote to the ministry. I argued that the analogy to binding magical contracts was imperfect, and that insufficient precedent existed for this specific category of bond. The argument was considered and rejected." He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone who has run out of things to say, but in the way of someone who is choosing carefully. "I cannot override the ministry's ruling. I can continue to advocate for a review. But I don't want you to leave believing I have resources I don't have," Harry said. "So that's it." "There is an appeal process," Dumbledore said. "That is not nothing." He looked at them both with the look that acknowledged they were children in years only, and were carrying something that would have been heavy for anyone. "Some things that cannot be undone are wounds," he said. "And some are simply different from what came before. I have found over a very long time that it is generally too soon to know which, when you are first inside them." Harry didn't find this comforting. He appreciated that Dumbledore had not tried to make it sound better than it was, but the information that things might turn out to not be a wound was not especially useful at the moment of sitting inside it. He glanced at Hermione. She had closed her notebook. Her face said faintly that she had found some small, useful thing in what Dumbledore had offered. Not comfort exactly, but the shape of a possibility she could work with. That was Hermione. She could find something to do with almost anything, as long as it was framed as a problem rather than a grief. They found Ron in the common room after supper, in his favorite chair with a chessboard he'd been playing against himself. He saw their faces when they came in, and set the board aside. They sat. Harry talked. Hermione filled in the parts. He skipped. Ron listened the way he listened to chess problems, completely without interruption, working through it. When they finished, he was quiet. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "No," Harry said. "Is it permanent?" Harry looked at Hermione. "Yes," she said. Ron was quiet for longer. He looked at the chessboard. He looked at Harry. There was something in his face that Harry didn't quite have a name for. Not jealousy, not exactly, but occupying the same neighborhood. Then Ron looked away, and when he looked back, the thing in his face was either gone or not showing anymore. "Well," Ron said, "that's rubbish." Harry almost laughed. He didn't quite, but it was close, and close was something. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Ron reached over and moved a pawn on the chessboard, apparently resuming his game against himself. "You're both eating breakfast tomorrow," he said, in the tone of someone issuing a decision that had already been made. "And properly. Hermione looks like she hasn't slept, and you," he pointed at Harry, "had about 4 bites of dinner." "I had more than 4, Harry said. "I counted," Ron said, and moved another pawn. Mid-November came in with cold mornings, and the particular smell of Hogwarts in late autumn, wood smoke and damp stone and whatever the kitchens were producing at any given hour. The ruling had been delivered. The appeal had been acknowledged. There was nothing to do, for now, but live inside what had happened. Harry and Hermione established rules. They didn't sit down and write them formally. Hermione had briefly considered this, and then decided against it, because writing them down would have made the situation more real in a way neither of them needed just then. Instead, the rules emerged through conversation, piecemeal, over several exchanges held in corridors, and over breakfast, and once in a whispered agreement during a particularly dull break in defense against the dark arts. Rule 1. If either of them experienced something sharp, fear, acute pain, the kind of anger that spiked rather than simmered, they would send a note by end of day, not to explain necessarily, just to signal what you felt was mine. Don't worry about it. Rule 2. They would not go out of their way to be in the same room. The bond had a gravitational quality, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them intended to simply give in to it. They were people, not compass needles. Rule 3. If the pull intensified, the elastic tightening that came with distance or deliberate separation, they would tolerate it. The discomfort was not dangerous. The rules worked some of the time. There was a charms lesson in mid-November where the bond was nearly invisible. Whatever the subject involved, both of them were engaged with it, focused and calm, and the bond settled to a background hum so quiet it was almost like not being bonded at all. Harry sat 2 rows behind Hermione and thought about the problem in front of him and not about the thread. The charms professor moved between the desks and demonstrated the wand movement with the precision of someone who had been doing this for decades and still found it worth demonstrating properly, and Hermione's hand went up, then up again. Then again, Harry counted without meaning to. 18 times in the lesson. He understood, sitting there, what the bond did when it was quiet. It did not disappear. It created an involuntary attention. He knew, without effort, how many times she'd raised her hand and which questions had made her sit up slightly straighter, and whether she was pleased or frustrated with any given answer. He knew this, the way you knew what your own hand was doing. He was not sure yet whether this was better or worse. Than the bond being loud, there was a potions lesson the following week, where it was loud. Snape had a specific quality of attention for Harry that had nothing in common with how he looked at other students. It was not merely strict. Harry understood strict. He'd had strict teachers before. This was something colder and more personal, like being watched by something that had reached a decision about you before you arrived and was using every subsequent moment as confirmation. Snape found cause to single Harry out twice in the lesson, and by the second time, the tone involved suggested that Harry's presence in the subject was an affront to the subject itself. Harry's frustration climbed. He pressed it down. It climbed again. 3 seats to his left, Hermione gripped the edge of the workbench. She said, after class, in the corridor outside the dungeon, "Your feelings in potions are very loud." She said it the way she said most things she'd decided needed saying. Directly, without decoration. She did not look sorry about it. Harry apologized. She said there was nothing to apologize for. Her voice said something slightly different from her words, not because she was lying, but because both things were true. There was nothing he'd done wrong, and it was also, objectively, quite a lot to receive through someone else's bond. They were learning the grammar of something nobody had taught them, and the education was not comfortable or quick. Ron noticed things, not the specifics. He didn't have access to those, but the texture of them. The way Harry's head would come up half a second before Hermione entered a room they were both already in. The glances that passed between Harry and Hermione, sometimes in the middle of a lesson or a meal, not dramatic, not even noticeable if you weren't watching for it, just a mutual registration that something had moved between them. Ron was watching. He made a joke about it one afternoon in the common room after one of those glances. Harry couldn't afterward remember exactly what the joke was, only that the punchline didn't land properly, and that Ron went quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary, comfortable quiet, a silence with something underneath it that Harry didn't know how to reach into. He tried once, started a sentence, and Ron looked at him with an expression that said, "I know what you are going to say and don't," and Harry didn't. Hermione spent a Saturday afternoon in the library. She had a list. She always had a list of texts to locate on magical bonds and wizarding contract law. She worked through the shelves methodically, collecting what was available in the general section, noting what wasn't. The unavailable titles were longer than the available ones. Most of what she actually needed was not in the first-year reach of the stacks. She went to the front desk and asked the librarian for access to the restricted reference shelves. The librarian regarded her over the desk with the expression of someone who has been asked this by many first years and has not changed the answer in some time. "First year?" the librarian said. "Yes. You'll need a signed note from a professor." Hermione went back to her table. She took out her list and wrote, at the very top, in her smallest and most precise hand, "Get professor's note. Restricted access." She underlined it twice. Then she went back to working with what she had, which was not nothing, but was not enough. Harry, that same week, had noticed something he hadn't told Hermione about. It had started on a Tuesday, the first time he'd ended up near the third-floor corridor by accident. The moving staircases were still catching him out, and found himself standing close to the stretch that was forbidden. He knew it was forbidden. Everyone did. Dumbledore had said so on the first night of term. What Harry hadn't expected was that the bond's directional pull felt different there. Not stronger toward Hermione, who was nowhere near the third floor. Different in itself. A faint warping in the thread, like a compass needle, brought near a magnet, pointing somewhere it didn't usually point. He walked past twice more in the following week and felt it each time, the same subtle distortion, the same sense of something underneath the stone exerting its own pull on the magic between him and Hermione. He didn't tell her. He had no way to explain it that didn't sound worrying, and he didn't know yet what it meant. He lay in his dormitory later that night and listened to Ron's even breathing in the wind against the tower windows. The bond hummed quietly toward the floor above, where Hermione was presumably asleep with her lists. He thought about the Dursleys, about what it was to have things decided for you, and then he thought deliberately about something else, which was his habit with that particular line of thinking. He thought about Hermione and the librarian's no, and the way her face had done nothing at all when she heard it, except recalibrate immediately to the next available move. If he had to be tethered to someone, he thought, at least she was the kind of person who, when one door closed, started looking for the next door without stopping to be upset about the first one. He wasn't sure that made it better, but it was something. Hermione went to Dumbledore on the first Saturday of December. She had not wanted to ask for help. Asking for help implied that she had reached the edge of what she could manage alone, and she did not enjoy reaching that edge, and she had spent 3 weeks trying to find an alternative route before concluding that there wasn't one. The librarian's note requirement was a formal barrier, and formal barriers required formal solutions, and the most direct, formal solution was a professor's note, and the professor who knew everything relevant to their situation. She went, therefore, to Dumbledore. She explained concisely that she was pursuing research into magical bonds and wizarding contract law as it pertained to their situation, and that the texts she needed were held in the restricted reference section, and that she would require a note granting access. Dumbledore wrote the note without hesitation, without conditions, without the particular pause adults sometimes produced when they were deciding whether to let you do something. He handed it to her and said, "Have you found anything useful yet?" "Not yet," she said. He said, "Keep looking." It was, she realized, walking away with the note in her bag, the most straightforwardly encouraging thing he had offered them since this had all begun. Not reassurance about outcomes, just keep looking. Trust that the looking is worth doing. She found this more useful than the reassurance would have been. The restricted reference section was exactly what she'd expected from its reputation, and somewhat more than she'd hoped for. The texts were dry, legal, and dense, with the assumption that the reader already held ENEWT-level knowledge of magical contract theory. She read them anyway. She took notes in her smallest handwriting to fit as much as possible on each page, and she cross-referenced as she went, and she read the same passages twice when the first reading produced questions that the second might answer. The framework, she found, was this: binding magical contracts and the unbreakable vow were not, legally or magically, two separate categories. They were both classified under what one text called oaths of extremis, a term that covered bonds and agreements formed under conditions so severe that the magic involved treated them as intrinsically binding regardless of the mechanism of their formation. The unbreakable vow was the deliberate version. Conscious consent, deliberate casting, a bonder to witness and seal. The binding magical contract, the kind from the Goblet of Fire, which she had found referenced in 2 separate restricted texts, was the procedural version, a magical vessel designating participants who were then held to the competition's terms. Neither had ever been applied to an accidental bond. This was what she had been hoping to find, and it was there on the page in front of her, quiet and enormous. The ministry had applied the oaths of extremis framework to their bond by analogy, Not by direct statute. There was no direct statute governing accidental bonds, because nobody had ever written one, because until the 31st of October this year, there had apparently never been a bond of this specific type to legislate for. An appeal could argue that the analogy was imperfect. The framework required willing parties. Harry and Hermione had not been willing. They had not consented to anything. They had been 11 and 12 years old in a bathroom with a troll, and the magic had done what it had done without asking any of them. She was 12 years old, and she had just found a legal argument that the ministry's own barrister might not have made. She had to admit, quietly thrilled. Harry came to the library on the second evening. He appeared at the table across from her and sat down, with the slightly defensive posture of someone who has decided to be somewhere and would like it noted that they have decided, not drifted. The common room was loud, he said. "What do you need?" She handed him a list of titles. He found 3 of them on the first pass, returned with the correct books without complaint, and sat back down and opened the one on top. He read, she observed, differently from how she read, headings and subheadings first, then select passages, his eyes moving quickly across the page, and then stopping when something caught. He read headings rather than continuous text, which was not, she reminded herself, wrong. It was a different approach, systematic in its own way. He pulled at the hair above his right ear when the text was particularly dense. She noticed this without wanting to, filed it without intending to, and looked back at her own page. 10 minutes passed. "Willing," Harry said. She looked up. He had found it, the relevant passage, the critical word, the one she'd circled in her own notes that morning. He was looking at her over the open book, with the particular expression of someone who has understood something and wants to confirm it. "We weren't willing," he said. "Exactly," she said. It was the first time, she thought afterward, the first moment that was genuine alliance rather than enforced proximity. They had been adjusting to the bond for weeks, tolerating it, navigating around it, making rules about it. This was something different. This was the two of them looking at the same fact and knowing at the same moment that it was useful. She made a note, and Harry found the next book on her list. And they worked. Ron appeared on the 3rd evening. He came through the library doors with the air of someone who has made a deliberate decision, located them at their usual table, and sat down in the 3rd chair without preamble. He didn't particularly want to read legal theory about magical contracts. He also was not clearly going to let the library become a place that belonged to them and not to him. "What have you got?" he said. Hermione explained the appeal argument. She kept it brief. Ron responded better to the essential structure of a problem than to all its surrounding detail, which she had identified as one of the useful things about him. Ron considered this. "So they made the rule for a different situation and applied it to yours, and the rule doesn't quite fit." "Yes," she said. "That's just what Fred and George do," Ron said. "Find the gap between how a rule was written and how it actually applies. Drive a broomstick through it." He said it without particular admiration. It was simply a fact about his brothers, descriptive rather than proud. "Do you need a broomstick?" Harry grinned. Ron looked at him and grinned back, the slightly surprised grin of someone who has just remembered that everything is all right between them, and for a moment they were simply 3 first years in the library, and the bond was irrelevant and the ministry was somewhere else, and the gap between how things were and how they should be had temporarily narrowed too. Nothing. Then Hermione said they needed to draft the appeal argument formally and ask Dumbledore to co-sign it, since they were 12 and 11 and the ministry would not accept an unsupported petition from children. And the moment passed and they went back to work. She sealed her notes into a folder when they finally left, tying the ribbon with the particular care of someone who does not want the contents disturbed by haste. Harry watched her do it. She is relentless, he thought. He meant it with great respect. It was, he had decided, the most useful quality a person could have, in a situation like this, to be unwilling to stop, to keep finding the next thing to push against, to treat every refusal as a door that simply needed a different key. She would probably never know to be grateful for it, because she had probably never experienced it as a choice. It was just who she was. He picked up his bag and followed her out of the library. The castle was quiet over Christmas. Harry had stayed at Hogwarts before, in the sense that he had stayed at Hogwarts for 6 weeks of term and had not yet been anywhere else. But the holiday version was different. Fewer students, longer silences in the corridors, the particular quality of cold stone in empty buildings. Ron had stayed too. He'd wanted to come home, Harry knew, wanted the burrow and his mother's cooking, and the comfortable noise of a large family. But he had also not wanted to leave Harry alone in the castle over the holiday, and so he'd stayed, which was a fact Harry filed under the accumulating evidence of Ron's particular variety of friendship. Hermione had gone home. Harry had known she would. She'd talked about her parents with a careful kind of restraint that he was starting to read as love that didn't quite know how to be spoken aloud, the way people talked about things that mattered most when they'd had the longest time to get used to them. She had gone home to her Muggle parents for Christmas, and she was somewhere in England, and the Bond knew exactly which direction. Harry had not expected that. The distance had not diminished it at all. The thread pointed south, or approximately south, approximately in the direction of wherever Hermione's parents lived, with the same steady certainty it had in the castle when she was 2 floors up. He tested it, systematically, standing at different windows and in different corridors and comparing the angle. He'd written to her about it, because they kept notes about the Bond, the way Hermione kept notes about everything methodically, so that if they were going to appeal anything to anyone, they would have documentation. Ron had watched him write those letters, not intrusively. Ron wasn't intrusive, but present, in the way friends were present when they were sitting in the same room and noticing things without saying they were noticing them. He had watched Harry angle his head slightly toward whatever window was most directly south before picking up his quill. He had not said anything. When Hermione came back in January, she came back with 2 weeks of her own notes, her own observations about the Bond's behavior at distance, a list of new questions, and the particular confidence of someone who has spent the holiday thinking productively. She and Harry sat down at the library table the first evening back and compared notes quickly and efficiently, filling in each other's gaps, and within 20 minutes they had established 3 new properties of the Bond. Ron sat across the common room and watched, and said nothing. It was a study session 2 weeks into January that broke things open. They were in the small room off the common room that the older students used for group study, 4 of them, Harry and Ron and Hermione and Neville, who had a transfiguration assignment and was desperate enough to accept help from anyone. Hermione had been explaining a particular theory about switching spells that Neville had got wrong, and then Ron had said something incorrect about the underlying principle, and Hermione had corrected him gently. The correction was genuinely gentle. She had learned over the autumn that there were ways of saying someone was wrong that were less likely to cause problems, and she had applied one of them. Ron said, "Not everyone needs to know everything, Hermione." Hermione said nothing. She went back to her notes. The Bond delivered her hurt to Harry. Not loudly, just present a small, cold weight dropping quietly into the middle of his chest, settling there. He knew what it was. He could tell the texture of her emotions, now the same way you could tell the difference between different kinds of silence. He said Ron's name. That was all, just his name, in a tone that said, "I know." Ron went, still. He looked at Harry. Something moved in his face that Harry had not seen there before, or perhaps he had seen it before and not understood what it was. "You always know," Ron said. His voice was quiet. "Not angry yet. Whatever she's feeling, you know. Like you're carrying her around inside you." "Ron, it's been 3 months." He wasn't looking away. 3 months of you knowing things about her that I don't know. Things I can't know. I'm your best friend, and there's a whole part of your life now that I'm just outside of." He paused. "I didn't sign up for that." The room had gone very still. Neville was looking at his transfiguration essay with enormous concentration, the way people looked at things when they very much wanted not to be in the room they were in. Harry said, "The bond isn't my fault," which was true, which was, in this moment, the exact wrong thing to say. He knew it the instant it left his mouth, could feel it land, wrong, could feel Ron's face change. True but wrong was its own particular kind of useless, and Harry was 11 years old and did not yet have the vocabulary for anything better. Ron stood up. He gathered his things without rushing, which was somehow worse than rushing. "I know it's not your fault," he said. "I didn't say it was your fault." He left the study room. The door did not bang. The fact that it did not bang made it harder to bear. Harry sat for a moment in the quiet of the room with Neville very carefully looking elsewhere, and Hermione not looking anywhere at all. The bond pulled at him, faint, directional, the thread pointing toward wherever Hermione was feeling something she was refusing to show. He could follow it. He could go to her. He picked up his bag and followed Ron. He found him in the common room, in front of the fire, staring into it with the posture of someone who has been waiting to be found and will not admit to it. Harry sat down beside him. He didn't apologize. He had thought about it on the way down and decided he hadn't been wrong about the fact of the thing, only about how he'd said it, and he didn't have words yet for the difference. He sat beside Ron and looked at the fire and said, "You're still my first friend." Ron said nothing. The fire crackled. A second year across the room laughed at something. The portrait on the wall over the mantelpiece sighed and shifted. "I know," Ron said. "They didn't fix everything." Harry didn't think everything was fixable in one conversation anyway, and he suspected Ron didn't either. But they sat by the fire until the common room started to empty, and the fracture in the thing between them stopped widening. The ache started later. Harry didn't know what to call it at first. It was new, a symptom he hadn't catalogued before. A low, persistent pressure behind his ribs, not sharp enough to be pain, not diffuse enough to be anxiety. Like pressing a finger against a bruise that spread across the whole chest. He pressed his palm against his sternum, which was an instinct and didn't help. But he did it anyway. There was a note under his dormitory door before he'd been in bed an hour. Hermione's handwriting, 4 words on a small square of parchment. I felt it too, nothing else. He looked at the note for a while and then set it on the beside table and lay back, and the bond ached its way through the night like something working through. Hermione sat in the dormitory with her notes open on her knee, her candle burning down. She wrote, "Bond intensification observed under conditions of high emotional duress. New symptom, sustained low-pressure ache, distinct from the directional pull or emotional echo. Duration, ongoing. Cause interpersonal conflict involving bonded parties and secondary close associate." She stopped. She crossed out secondary close associate. She wrote Harry and Ron and me. She looked at the page for a while. She thought about Ron's face in the study room when he'd said, "I didn't sign up for that," the way it had been. Not quite angry, which had made it harder to dismiss than anger would have been. He had meant every word of it. So had Harry, and so had she, in the silence she'd kept while it happened. The bond hummed steadily in the direction of the boys' dormitory below. She did not follow it. She closed her notebook, put the candle out and lay in the dark, and thought, "We are going to have to find a way to handle this that none of us know yet." Then she thought, "Therefore, I should start looking for it." That thought at least was familiar. She held it and tried to sleep. The appeal was filed on the 14th of February. This was, Hermione said, coincidental to the date, and she did not need anyone to point it out. And Harry had not been about. He hadn't registered the date until she mentioned it, which proved he felt that he had better things to occupy his attention than the calendar. The ministry acknowledged receipt 4 days later, a formal letter, bureaucratic and impersonal, confirming that the appeal had been reviewed for completeness and that a hearing had been scheduled for late April. The letter was addressed to Albus Dumbledore rather than to Harry or Hermione directly, since they were 11 and 12, and the ministry preferred its correspondence to have achieved a majority of years. Dumbledore passed it to them at breakfast on a Wednesday, already folded, with the particular neutrality of a man who has nothing further to add to a document. So they waited. The waiting had a different quality from what came before. February was a held breath. Late spring felt close, and impossibly far simultaneously, the way important things on the calendar always did. Harry had noticed Quirrell watching him, not in the way teachers watched students, not with the corrective attention of someone monitoring raised hands or the bored management of a classroom. Quirrell watched him with something flatter than that, and less directed in the sense of having no gradient. The same quality at 20 feet as at 5. The same whether Harry was looking back or not. He had caught it twice in the corridor outside defense against the dark arts, once in the great hall, and once with a crawling sensation across the back of his neck, at a distance he could not precisely measure. He mentioned it to Ron, who said Quirrell was strange and everyone knew that. Harry said yes, but. Ron said yes, but what? Harry couldn't articulate the but, which was frustrating. He didn't mention it to Hermione yet. The thing he was trying to describe did not have a shape he could hand to her. The evening it happened was a Thursday in late February, cold and grey, from morning and dark by 5 o'clock. Harry had been to the owlery with a letter on Ron's behalf. Something about a birthday, something for Mrs. Weasley, and was returning via the main staircase when one of the staircases shifted beneath him, swung him 15 degrees left. He had not intended the 3rd floor. He stood for a moment in the torchlit corridor, getting his bearings, identifying the route back. The corridor was quiet. Most of the castle was at supper. The door at the far end, the one Dumbledore had told them, very specifically, on the first night of term, was strictly off-limits and would involve a painful death, was closed and unremarkable at a distance. The bond's pull in this stretch of corridor was different. Harry had noticed it before, not a thread direction toward Hermione, but a slope, a slight tilt in the awareness, as if something beneath the stone was exerting its own pull on the magic, bending the thread sideways from its usual bearing. He was standing in it feeling the tilt when he heard footsteps. Quirrell came around the corner. He was carrying nothing. He saw Harry and stopped. His eyes went very still, not wide or narrow, simply still. In a way, eyes were not usually still. "Harry Potter," he said. He did not stammer. Harry had noticed over the autumn that Quirrell stammered only when other teachers were present. "Professor," Harry said. "Out late," Quirrell said. He was not looking at Harry's face. He was looking at a point that was neither Harry's face nor the corridor behind him, somewhere in between, like a man watching something that was slightly elsewhere. Near this corridor particularly. "The stairs moved me. I'm heading back." "Of course," Quirrell said, "the stairs." He looked at the door at the end of the corridor, then back at Harry. There was no warmth in it, no curiosity of the kind a teacher's face usually carried. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, "how they bring you here." Harry said nothing. "You should go back to supper," Quirrell said. He smiled. It was the worst thing his face did before it gets cold. Harry went. He was halfway down the main staircase when the bond fired. It was not the low, aching pressure of the argument's aftermath, or the faint emotional echo of most days. This was sharper than anything the bond had ever carried. A bolt of fear. His own fear, with his own specific texture, the particular quality of standing alone in a corridor with something wrong and knowing it. Moving through the channel between them like current through a wire. Hermione had been finishing a charms essay at the table by the window in the common room. She was on her feet before she knew why. Ron, across the room at his chessboard, looked up. She was already at the portrait hole. "What's wrong?" he said. "Harry," she said. Nothing else. The portrait swung open and she went. She found him in the stairwell above the second floor, sitting on a step with his back against the wall, his breathing even, his hands not quite steady. Quirrell had been gone for several minutes. The corridor was empty. Harry looked up. "I felt that," Hermione said. "I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for that." Her voice was not loud, but it had the quality of a door closed firmly. "Don't ever apologize for that. That is exactly what it is for." Harry was quiet. He was at the third-floor corridor. He said Quirrell. He wasn't stammering. What did he say? He said it was funny how the stairs moved me there. Harry thought about it, turning the words over, the way you turned something to see where the wrongness was. He looked at the door. Hermione sat on the step beside him. Not touching, they generally maintained a careful distance, Rule 2 still holding. But present, the bond a steady, close-range hum. She was quiet for the time she needed to sort things into their correct categories. "We should tell Dumbledore," she said. They told him the next morning before breakfast, in the corridor outside his office where he sometimes walked at that hour. Dumbledore listened without interrupting. Harry told him about the watching, the corridor, the conversation, the smile that was worse than the silence. Hermione added what she had received through the bond. When they finished, Dumbledore was quiet for several seconds. "Thank you for telling me," he said, with the weight of someone who has been given information they expected and is glad to have it confirmed. "I want you both to stay away from the third-floor corridor. Will you do that?" They said they would. Harry watched Dumbledore's face. He had been watching it since November, learning its separate language. Dumbledore's face now was not surprised. It was not performing the reaction of a man receiving new information. It was the particular stillness of a man who is holding something already and has now been handed another piece of it. He knows, Harry thought. He has known something about all of this for some time, and he is waiting for whatever comes next. Harry didn't say any of it. "All right," he said. They went to breakfast. That evening he sat in the dormitory and turned the thing over. The bond had carried his fear to Hermione in approximately 5 seconds, and she had come through the portrait hole without knowing where he was, found a stairwell on the wrong floor, and arrived before he'd finished working out whether he needed to be more frightened than he already was. He had not called her. He had not known she was coming. She had come anyway. If the appeal succeeded, late April, the ministry panel, the argument, Hermione had built with 4 months of library research. The bond would dissolve. The directional pull would go. The emotional echo would go. The aching, the elastic, tightening, the involuntary attention, the 18 raised hands he counted without meaning to in Charm's lessons, the way the thread behind his sternum tilted every time he got near the 3rd floor. The distress signal would go with it. He thought about that for a while, sitting on his bed with the dormitory dark around him, and Ron's breathing, evening out into sleep behind the curtains. He had spent 4 months wanting to be rid of the bond. He had thought of the Dursleys, of things decided without his consent, of what it meant to have something done to him without asking. These were legitimate grievances. He was not going to pretend otherwise. And also, he looked at his hands. Maybe some tethers, he thought, were also ropes. He didn't tell Hermione. He didn't have the right words for it yet. He lay back in the dark and let the bond hum its ordinary hum. Late April. He would know more. Then, the hearing room was small and wood-paneled and smelled of parchment and something older, the accumulated smell of official decisions made over a long time. 3 officials sat behind a curved desk. The one in the center was a stout woman with close-cropped gray hair and the composed expression of someone whose time is precisely accounted for. She did not introduce herself by name. 2 others, one on either side, took notes and did not speak. The official on the left had a very new quill which scratched loudly enough to be distracting. Harry and Hermione sat in the chairs facing the desk. Dumbledore sat slightly behind and to the left, the position of an advocate, not a principal. His half-moon spectacles were at their usual position on the bridge of his crooked nose, and his hands were folded on his knee, and he was, Harry thought, being deliberately unimposing. Dumbledore at full presence would have been difficult to ignore. The official read the case reference number, aloud. She asked Hermione to state her name and year. She asked Harry to do the same. Then she said, "Miss Granger, the appeal is on your behalf, as the primary drafter of the written submission. You may present your argument." Hermione was 12 years old, and she had been preparing for this since December, and she stood up. She did not have notes. She had notes in her bag, but she did not take them out. She spoke in the voice she used when she was very certain, even in tone, unrushed. And what came out was the argument she had built piece by piece in the restricted reference section of the Hogwarts library across the winter months. The binding magical contract analogy, she said, was legally correct in form, but imperfect in substance. The law governing binding contracts required 2 willing participants. The unbreakable vow, which sat in the same legal category, required conscious consent and deliberate casting. The bond formed between herself and Harry Potter on the 31st of October 1991 had been formed under conditions of extreme physical danger, between 2 underage children, by accidental magic over which neither party had any control. The Ministry had applied the contract framework by analogy, not by direct statute. There was no direct statute governing involuntary accidental bonds, because until this year the situation had not arisen. She was asking the panel to consider whether applying an analogy in the absence of a direct statute constituted the kind of legal precision the Ministry required for a ruling of this permanence. The official in the center looked at her for a moment without expression. "How old are you, Miss Granger?" she said. 12, Hermione said. The official made a small note. She conferred briefly with the man on her right. In the particular murmur of a conversation that is not intended to be private, but is not intended to be heard clearly, either the man on the left's quill kept scratching. Harry sat completely still. The bond was there at its usual hum, slightly closer at this distance, and through it he got a faint wash of what Hermione was feeling, not the triumph of having made the argument, not relief, but a careful, focused waiting. She was not breathing any differently. She had her hands in her lap, and she was watching the panel with the expression she used when she was reading something that might say either of two things, and she was holding both possibilities simultaneously until the text resolved. The official looked up. "The panel has considered the appeal," she said. "Miss Granger's argument is noted. The panel acknowledges that the ministry applied the binding contract framework by analogy in the absence of direct statute. However, in the absence of a direct statute governing this specific category of bond, it is the ministry's responsibility to apply the nearest applicable legal framework. The binding magical contract category is the nearest applicable framework in current wizarding law." She paused. "The appeal is denied. The original ruling stands." She said it, without apology and without satisfaction. It was simply the ruling. Hermione pressed her lips together very hard. She reached into her bag and took out her notebook. She opened it to the page she had prepared. It was, Harry could see from beside her, a clean page with a heading and a column of anticipated outcomes. She uncapped her ink and wrote 4 words in the margin, small and very precise: "Appeal denied, no precedent." Then she drew a horizontal line below it and capped her ink and closed the notebook and put it back in her bag. She had reached the edge of what research could do, and she was sitting at the edge looking at it. Her face said nothing that was not entirely under her control. Harry said nothing. He was not sure what he would say, and he did not yet know which feeling to start with. Dumbledore escorted them out. They took the lift back to the atrium without speaking. The fountain in the center of the atrium caught Harry's attention for a moment. A group of golden statues, a wizard and a witch, and various creatures, and he looked at it without quite seeing it. The journey back to Hogwarts took time, and Dumbledore gave them the time. He did not fill silence, because he was uncomfortable with it. Harry and Hermione sat across from each other, and the countryside moved past the windows, and eventually Harry said, "So that's it then, not a question." He had known it was coming. He had been preparing for months, since the ruling in November, since Dumbledore had said he could not override the ministry's law. Hermione said, "For now," Harry said. "Is there an after now?" She didn't answer immediately. The countryside went past. He waited. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm not done looking." He thought about that for a while. She had reached the edge of what research could do, and she was looking at it. And she was already looking past it. He had watched her do it before, with the librarians, no, with the November ruling every time. She wrote it down and drew a line under it, and started looking for the next thing. He said, "Okay, just that." He shrugged once slightly. She looked back out the window. The bond ran its quiet hum between them, the same as it had every day since October, the same as it would tomorrow. Dumbledore spoke to them in the corridor outside the great hall, separately from the teachers moving past towards supper. He said the things he had said before. He was sorry. He would continue to advocate the ministry had acted within its own law. Then he paused and said one thing he had not said before. "I have lived long enough to see many things that could not be undone," he said. "Some were wounds. Some were simply different from what existed before, in ways that took time to understand." He looked at them both over his spectacles. "I cannot tell you which this is, but I have noticed over a very long time that the two things do not always look alike from the inside." He was trying. Harry could see that he did not entirely succeed, and that he knew it, and that he offered it anyway. Harry said, "Thank you, Professor." Dumbledore nodded and went. Ron was at the portrait hole when they arrived at Gryffindor Tower. He had a chessboard under his arm and an expression of studied nonchalance that did not quite conceal the fact that he had been waiting. He took in their faces. He set up the chessboard in front of the fire and handed Harry the white pieces, and they played. And Harry was distracted and careless and lost in 7 moves. And Ron sat back in his chair with the specific satisfaction of someone who has not had to let anyone win. "Absolute disaster," Ron said, surveying the board. He sounded profoundly pleased. Harry almost laughed. "Close enough." The Bond hummed quietly toward the other side of the room, where Hermione had settled at the table by the window with her notebook, uncapped her ink, and begun writing something he couldn't see. She was not writing in the margin this time. She had turned to a new page. He thought, "She is not done looking." And then he looked back at the ruined chessboard and said, Again, Ron started resetting the pieces. The fire crackled. The common room settled around them, warm and ordinary the way it was every evening, as if the day had not been what it had been. The Bond hummed. The evening continued. The news came through McGonagall at dinner on a Thursday in May. Dumbledore had been called to London on urgent ministry business and had already departed. She delivered it in the composed voice she used for announcements that were not, in themselves, distressing. He felt it before she finished the sentence. Not the words, the change in the castle. Something shifted the moment McGonagall said it. The Bonds pulled toward the 3rd floor, which had been a background slope since November. A barely there tilt in the directional awareness spiked sharply and settled into something new. Not painful present, a pull with purpose behind it. He put his fork down. He found Ron and Hermione after dinner and said, "Something is going to happen tonight." "That's not specific," Hermione said. "The Bond, near the 3rd floor. It changed when Dumbledore left." Ron looked at him, then looked at the ceiling, which was the direction of the 3rd floor from the Great Hall, then back at Harry. "Tell a teacher," Hermione said. "McGonagall will send us to bed," Ron said. "Snape more so. Without Dumbledore tonight, nothing happens." He looked at Harry. "How strong is it?" Harry pressed a hand to his sternum. "Stronger than it's ever been since October." Hermione said, "I still think." But Harry had already started walking. He heard Ron's footsteps behind him almost immediately, which was the sound of a decision made without deliberation. A moment later, Hermione's faster. The 3rd floor corridor was empty and very quiet. The door at the end was ajar through the gap. Silence. He pushed it open. The 3-headed dog lay sprawled on the stone floor, all 3 heads slack, breathing the slow rhythm of deep unconsciousness. The harp in the corner had run out of music. On the floor, a trapdoor, open. "Someone's already gone through," Hermione said. Very quiet. "Quirrell," Harry said. Ron was looking at the dog. "Don't step on it," he said, which was both the most obvious and the most necessary thing to say. They went carefully around the enormous paws, and Harry dropped through the trapdoor first, Hermione second, Ron last. Below was darkness, and then a landing, and then the darkness moved. Harry hit something that was both soft and very strong, and understood immediately that the soft, strong thing was alive and had opinions about his presence. Vines, or what read as vines, wound around his ankle and his wrist in the same motion, tightening before he'd processed the word tightening. "Don't struggle," Hermione said, very sharp, from somewhere to his left. "Stop moving! Devil snare, it tightens if you fight it." She stopped struggling. He stopped struggling. The vines did not release, but they slowed. He could breathe. Light, Hermione said. Fire, it recoils from. A pause, not panic, just calculation. Then she drew her wand and produced a bright, sustained flame, the kind that was genuinely hot rather than decorative. The vines recoiled sharply, and Harry dropped, and Hermione dropped beside him, and Ron came through from above and managed to go limp before landing, and the flames drove the snare back from all three of them. The plant retreated into its corner and was still. They stood in a chamber at the bottom of the shaft. Ahead, a door, lit by the eerie light of Hermione's flame. Harry's wrist was faintly bruised where the vine had held. He did not mention it through the door. Keys. The room was full of them. Hundreds of winged keys swooping in slow arcs around a high domed ceiling, glittering and restless. Harry had the correct broom off the stand before Ron had fully entered the room. He was in the air before he could explain why. He was the youngest seeker in a century, which had felt abstract once and felt entirely different now. The bond was live and singing with his focus. When his attention locked onto a target, Hermione received it the way you received a direction from a compass. He had not considered what that meant in a room full of moving keys. He swept the ceiling looking for the one with the bent wing, and every false lock and sharp refocus carried through the bond, and Hermione below received all of it in real time. She understood before he did. She tracked the direction of his focus. When he locked hard, different from the others, longer, the quality of almost certain she looked there. There, she said, up and to the right. He had already started diving. The key tried to flee. He was faster. It feinted left, and he went with the feint and had it in his fist before it could change direction again. He came down at speed, controlled barely, and thrust it into the lock. It worked. Move, Harry said. They moved. The next chamber stopped them all in the doorway. Chess pieces, life-size, filling the room in the formation of an end game. On the far side, another door. Between them and it, the board, fully occupied, waiting. Ron was very still beside Harry for one moment. Then he walked to the center of the room and looked at the board. It was brutal. Harry could see that much, and he was not a chess player. The kind of board that required sacrifice, not incidental, but central. Ron looked at it for a long time. "I know what to do," he said, in the tone of someone who has arrived at a fact they don't like and has decided to accept it anyway. He played the board. Harry and Hermione moved where directed. Ron moved himself into position as a knight, Harry realized. A knight being sacrificed to clear the queen's path. And when the white queen moved to take him, the blow came, and Ron went down-winded, unmoving on the stone. "Oh," Ron said without looking up. His voice was steady. That was the thing about Ron, even on the stone floor of a chess chamber with his pieces scattered around him. His voice was steady. "I'm fine." Harry looked at him for one moment, Ron's hand raised slightly, dismissive, meaning, "I mean it," and then Harry went. The next chamber had a smell, something herbal and sweet and slightly wrong. 7 bottles stood in a line on a narrow stone shelf beside the door, different shapes and sizes, the potions inside them catching the torchlight in different colors. On the floor, 2 arches of purple-black fire and white fire blocked the ways forward and back. A rolled piece of parchment lay beside the bottles. Hermione read it in less than a minute. Harry watched her face. She was doing the thing she did when the problem was real. Not performing the working, just doing it, moving through the logic, quickly and without looking up. She picked up a small round bottle. "Forward," she said. "1 dose, that's you." "And you?" She held up another, smaller and coldly glowing. Back through the fire. Back to Ron. She put it in her pocket. You'll be alone from here. He looked at the purple-black flames between him and whatever came next. The bond. He started will be there, she said, quieter, but there. She met his eyes. Go. He drank the potion. Cold and clear and sharp down the length of him. He stepped through the fire. The flames didn't burn. He stepped out the other side. The potion was cold and clean going down. Not the taste of something difficult, just cold and clear and sharp. He stepped through the purple-black fire. The flames did not burn. He came out the other side. The chamber beyond was round and high, lit in the center by the light from the mirror of Erist which stood against the far wall on its carved feet, with the inscription along the top, curling in a language Harry couldn't read. It reflected back a version of the room that showed more than the room contained, standing before the mirror, his, back to Harry Quirrell. He had a stillness that was not the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of something concentrated, something focused entirely elsewhere. Then he turned. Harry had known from October to this evening that something was wrong with Quirrell. He had felt it in the watching, in the corridor, in the smile that was the worst thing his face did. He had not imagined this. Quirrell's expression was not surprised. It was the expression of something that had been waiting. I wondered, Quirrell said, when you'd come. He did not stammer at all. He reached up and unwound his turban. The bond was very quiet. Hermione was moving away through the chambers, behind Harry, back the way they had come, farther with every moment. He could feel it in the thread, the familiar elastic pull, the stretch. He stood in the last room of the stone's defenses, and the bond hummed its distant hum, and below the turban was a face that should not have been there. And the face opened its eyes and looked at him. Quirrell did not look at Harry the way teachers looked at students, or the way adults looked at children, or even the way enemies looked at each other. He looked at Harry the way something looked at a problem it had nearly solved. Come here, he said. Look in the mirror and tell me what you see. The mirror of Arised stood behind Quirrell, its carved frame catching the chamber's torchlight, the inscription along the top curling backward and unreadable. Harry looked at it and saw himself older, calmer, holding something in his closed fist. He saw his own reflection open the fist. A small red stone sat in the reflected palm, catching the light, flashing colors like something alive. Then the reflection closed its hand, and the stone was gone, and Harry felt something heavy drop into his actual pocket. He did not flinch. He kept his face still. I see myself, he said, shaking hands with Dumbledore, winning a prize. Quirrell stared at him. Something moved behind Quirrell's eyes that was not Quirrell. He lies, said a voice. It did not come from Quirrell's face. It came from elsewhere, from behind, and it was not the voice of a man, or not of a man, still fully made. It was the voice of something old and cold and used to being obeyed, a voice that had outlasted its original body through pure insistence. Let me speak to him, the voice said. Quirrell's hands went to his turban. His heel touched the wall behind him. He had nowhere to go. Quirrell unwound the turban, layer by layer, and turned around. The face on the back of his head was chalk white and flat-featured and had no nose, only slits where a nose should have been. Its eyes were red, and they opened and found Harry immediately. Harry Potter, said Lord Voldemort. It was the name said in that voice, with those eyes on him, that produced the terror Harry had not yet experienced. Not the blind panic of the troll, which had been animal and fast, but something slower. the understanding that the thing looking at him had been trying to kill him since before he could remember, that it had killed his parents, that it was wearing a dead man's body and had come back for reasons that had his name in them. He stood very still. "You have something I want," Voldemort said. "Give it to me and you will not be harmed. I am willing even now to be generous." Harry said nothing. His hand was in his pocket, pressed against the stone. "Kill him," Voldemort said. "Take it." Quirrell moved. His hands reached for Harry's wrist, and Harry went sideways, stumbling, and Quirrell's fingers caught his forearm instead, and the burn began. Harry felt it, and Quirrell felt it, and the sound Quirrell made was not a scream from pain, but from something worse, the sound of someone who had not expected what was happening to happen to them. The burn was not fire. It was something hotter than fire, and more deliberate, moving from every point of contact between Quirrell's skin and Harry's, spreading up Quirrell's hands with the specific intentionality of magic that has a purpose. Lily Potter had died in this boy's name. The magic of that death lived in Harry's skin, in his blood, in the scar on his forehead that had ached and burned all year in Quirrell's presence, and was now lit with a pain so bright it had gone past pain into something Harry had no word for. He could not think in words. He could only hold on. He grabbed Quirrell's wrist. Both hands he held. The bond fired. Not the ache of January or the spike of February. Something larger, a signal so sudden it tore loose from the usual channel and went like a crack of thunder across every chamber, and flame and chess piece and devil's snare between them. Hermione was in the chess chamber. She had returned for Ron through the fire, as she'd said she would, and found him sitting up on his own, winded but unhurt, already moving his limbs to check their function the way Ron did, practically, without fuss. She had got an arm under his shoulder, and he had got to his feet, and she was saying something about moving carefully when it hit. She stopped mid-word. Ron said, "What?" She let go of his arm. She was already turning. It was not like February's spike. That had been Harry's fear, arriving through the bond, the way sound arrived through a door. Recognizable, nameable. This was Harry's fear, arriving the way a wall arrived when you walked into it, total, immediate. The specific terror of a child who has understood that the thing looking at him wants him dead. She ran. Ron called after her. She could not explain. She ran toward what the bond was pulling her toward, through the chess chamber, through the door, into the corridor, past the mountain troll's chamber without stopping, toward the purple-black fire. She drank what was left of the forward potion from her pocket. Barely enough. She didn't know if it was enough, and stepped through. She came out the other side. Quirrell was falling. Harry felt it as a change in resistance. The burning hands going slack, the grip loosening, Quirrell's legs giving out beneath him. Voldemort screamed commands, in the voice from the back of the head, commands that Quirrell's body could no longer obey. Quirrell's hands were. Harry did not look at them, he felt them, and what he felt was wrong, in the specific way of something damaged beyond repair. He held on until he couldn't. He held on until Quirrell went down, and the screaming from the back of the head became a different quality of sound, not commanding anymore, not even angry, just the sound of something very old finally losing its grip. Then something tore. Something left the room, a wisp, a shadow, a thing that had been clinging to a borrowed body and now had nothing left to cling to. Harry fell. The floor was cold against his face. His hands were burning, not Quirrell's burn, his own, now the reflection of the contact, his palms bright with it. The stone was still in his pocket. He knew it was there, and he could not quite reach the pocket, and the chamber was very quiet, and then it was not quiet at all. It was simply nothing. The final door was not locked. Hermione went through it at speed and stopped. The chamber was empty, except for Harry, who was on the stone floor, prone, one hand outstretched, as if he had tried to catch himself. The mirror stood where it had stood, reflecting back the room, reflecting back Harry, lying still. The air smelled of something burnt. A specific smell, organic and wrong. The smell of magic that had consumed something it was never meant to touch. There was no one else. Whatever had been here. She crossed the room in 4 strides and knelt. She checked his pulse first, the way they had learned in Muggle primary school. 2 fingers at the wrist, which she had thought was only for emergencies, and which was now clearly for emergencies. His pulse was there, fast and light and there. She exhaled. "Harry," she said. His name at normal volume. Then again, quieter. "Harry." The bond was very quiet. He was unconscious and the bond reflected it. The hum was still present, the directional thread still pointing from her to him across the distance of 4 feet. But the quality had changed, gone slow and low and even, like something sleeping. She had never felt it like this before. It felt like breathing. She did not leave. She sat on the stone floor beside him and put one hand on his arm, not gripping, not holding on, just present, and watched his face for the twitching signs of consciousness returning, and the mirror watched them both with its own silent watchfulness. She heard the door behind her. She turned. Dumbledore stood in the doorway. He looked first at Harry, then at her. His face moved through something she couldn't fully read, relief, she thought, and something older. He did not look surprised. He looked tired in the way of someone who has been moving quickly towards something they knew they had to reach. She did not stand up. "Is he alive?" she said. Just that. Dumbledore crossed the room and crouched beside Harry and looked at him with the attention of someone who knew what to look for. The chamber was quiet enough that she could hear the slight sound of his breath and the faint, distant echo of the castle around them. "He is alive," Dumbledore said. She exhaled once, controlled. The way she exhaled when she had finished something that needed finishing. Then she stood. Her hand, she noticed, was still on Harry's arm. She took it away and stood up straight and looked at Dumbledore, who looked back at her over his half-moon spectacles with an expression that acknowledged she had done something in this chamber tonight that was not small, and said nothing about it, and that was, she thought, he woke to the particular white light of the hospital wing. His hands were bandaged, both of them, heavily to the wrists, and there was the smell of something medicinal, and above him the stone ceiling of Hogwarts was doing what it always did, which was being very far up and very grey. He lay still for a moment. He took stock. His hands ached in a muffled way that suggested the ache was much larger under the bandages and had been deliberately softened. His head was clear. The bond was there. That was the first clear thought. The bond was there. The directional hum, pointing to his left and slightly above, not the girls' dormitory. He was in the hospital wing. So slightly above meant somewhere in the castle he couldn't picture, and through it, at this distance, a faint quality of wakefulness. He lay still and felt it. She was awake. She had been awake for a while. The door of the hospital wing opened. Hermione was still in her robes from the night before. She had not changed, and she had not slept. He could see both of these facts in the particular quality of her posture, the kind of upright that was held, rather than natural, maintained through the night by will rather than rest. She had been somewhere waiting, and had come at the first sign that he was conscious, which meant she had been watching for that sign. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed and looked at him with an expression that was not quite relief, because relief had somewhere to release into, and this one was being kept very contained. "You ran through the defenses," Harry said. "The bond told me to. You didn't have to listen to it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. Then, "I wanted to." The words sat between them, different from everything else either of them had said about the bond across the entire year. Not, "We have to manage this." Not, "We have to appeal this." Not, "This is happening to us." "I wanted to." He turned it over once and put it somewhere and looked at her. "I'm glad you did," he said. The words were not large enough for what he meant by them, but they were the only ones available, and she was Hermione, and she would understand the difference. She nodded. That was enough. Ron arrived an hour later with a box of chocolate frogs that he had evidently borrowed from someone's care package. The box was slightly battered, with someone else's name on the side, which he was ignoring with great dignity. He sat in the second chair, looked at Harry, then looked at Hermione. "You ran through the whole thing," he said to her. "Not a question." "Yes," Hermione said. Ron nodded slowly. He looked at the battered box in his hands. He opened it and took out a chocolate frog and broke it cleanly in half and held out one half to Hermione. She looked at it. She took it. "Right," Ron said. "Good." He gave the other half to Harry and took a whole frog for himself and ate it in 2 bites and did not say anything else. He didn't need to. The offer had been the thing. The half frog to Hermione first, the for Harry, the for himself. The choice of that order made without drawing attention to it. Harry ate his half and said nothing, and understood that Ron had answered something this morning that had been a question since October. Dumbledore came in the afternoon. He sat in the chair Ron had vacated. Ron had gone to find lunch and had promised to come back, which he would, and he told Harry what there was to know. The stone had been destroyed. Quirrell was dead. Voldemort had fled, as he had fled once before, reduced, without a body, without a host, in the wraith form that had made him survivable when he should not have been. He was gone from Hogwarts. He was, as far as anyone could determine, gone for now. Harry listened. When Dumbledore finished, Harry said, "What about the bond?" Dumbledore regarded him. "The Ministry has issued a final statement. No further appeals will be accepted. The ruling stands." "I know," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him over his half-moon spectacles, which had the slight effect of looking at someone over a very careful question. "You seem less troubled by that than I expected," he said. Harry thought about it. He thought about Hermione in the doorway this morning, still in her robes, watching for signs that he was conscious. He thought about a bond that had carried his terror across a castle's worth of stone and fire and moving chess pieces and delivered it with enough force to make her run. "She ran back through the defenses," he said. "I think maybe the bond knew something. I didn't." He paused. "About what it was for." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. He did not say anything. He put one hand briefly on Harry's bandaged one, a light touch, not a grip, and stood up and went. In the corridor outside the hospital wing, he paused. He had lived long enough to recognize ancient magic when it moved. What he had seen last night and this morning had the same texture as things he had spent decades trying to understand, not manufactured, not learned, but something older than the laws that tried to govern it. He thought of protections that could not be chosen for, that chose themselves through love and proximity, and the body's insistence on what mattered. He did not have a name for what the bond was. He walked on. The end-of-year feast was the feast that year one always ended with, only different. Slytherin had been winning the House Cup until Dumbledore stood and looked around the great hall over his half-moon spectacles and began to speak. He said that recent events required the consideration of some last-minute points. He gave 60 points to Harry Potter for nerve and outstanding courage in the face of something most adults would have fled. He gave 50 points to Ron Weasley for the best game of chess Hogwarts had seen in many years. He gave 50 points to Hermione Granger for cool logic in the face of fire. He gave 10 points to Neville Longbottom for the particular and underrated courage of standing up to his friends. Gryffindor's total came to 482 points. Slytherin had 472. The Great Hall produced the particular noise of a year's worth of Gryffindors discovering they had won something they had not expected to win, which was loud and somewhat chaotic and lasted for a considerable time. Harry sat in the middle of it at the Gryffindor table, his bandaged hands in his lap, and through the bond he felt Hermione, not jubilation, not the performing of celebration, but a quiet, specific satisfaction, the particular quietness of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. He let himself feel it. He didn't try to catalogue it or name it or document it. He decided, sitting at the Gryffindor table with the noise of the hall around him and Ron's shoulder, warm against his and the bond humming its small, faithful hum, that he didn't mind knowing that about her. The Hogwarts Express pulled away from Hogsmeade Station on a clear morning in late June. They had the same compartment they always found by some unspoken agreement, the three of them with their trunks stacked in the rack above and the window letting in the brightness of a Scottish summer morning going past at speed. Ponter. Ron had his chess board. Hermione had a book. Harry had the window. He looked out at the countryside and thought he was going back to the Dursleys. Privet Drive, the cupboard that was now a bedroom because of the letters, the specific texture of a house where he was fed and clothed and not wanted and never quite warm. He had spent every September to June of his life knowing that July and August existed and were coming, and the knowledge had always been a weight, a thing to set aside and not examine too closely. This summer was different. He turned the difference over, looking for its edges. The same house, the same relatives, the same specific variety of unwelcome. What was different was the thread behind his sternum, pointing across the compartment with its usual faithful certainty toward Hermione John Granger, who was reading with her shoes off and her feet tucked underneath her, and a slightly severe expression that meant she had found something she was going to disagree with before she'd finished the chapter. He would write to her in July. She would write back with library references and questions documented in her smallest handwriting. The bond would point south, or wherever her parents lived. With the same certainty, it had pointed across the castle all year. He was not alone. He looked out the window and let the countryside go past, green and fast and ordinary, and thought, next year. Then he stopped thinking and let himself, for once, simply feel the thing that was there, the thread, the hum, the faithfulness of it, without needing to name it or resist it or appeal it to anyone.